Late evening descended on the quiet streets of a small suburban town, where a cozy cafe named Millie's Corner glowed invitingly against the twilight. Jason Statham, fresh off the grueling final day of shooting his latest action blockbuster, parked his unassuming car near the entrance. He was still in full makeup and costume, a rugged disguise crafted by the studio's skilled artists. Dirt smeared his face, his knuckles were bloodied, and his wardrobe, a combination of a tattered leather jacket and scuffed boots, screamed desperation. Normally, Jason would have cleaned up before heading out, but exhaustion won over vanity tonight. As he pushed open the cafe door, the quiet chime of the bell above announced his arrival. The interior was warm and inviting, with soft lighting illuminating walls lined with bookshelves and local artwork. A handful of patrons sat scattered across the room, each engrossed in their own little world. Jason approached the counter, nodding politely at the young barista, Liam, who offered a friendly smile despite the actor's disheveled appearance. "What can I get you?" Liam asked cheerfully, his eyes briefly flicking to Jason's muddied hands before returning to his face. Jason glanced at the chalkboard menu, squinting slightly. "Just a coffee, black, and... What's your special tonight?" "Chicken pot pie," Liam replied, tapping the counter for emphasis. "Best in town." "Sounds perfect," Jason said, fishing into his pocket for cash. He grimaced slightly, realizing his wallet was buried deep beneath layers of costume gear in his car. He pulled out a crumpled bill and a handful of coins instead, counting quietly to himself. Seated in a nearby corner, Evelyn, a middle-aged woman with a sharp bob and an even sharper tongue, observed the interaction with growing suspicion. Evelyn, a self-proclaimed neighborhood watch member, prided herself on her ability to spot trouble. And tonight, to her, trouble had walked in wearing a beaten leather jacket and an air of mystery. "Excuse me," Evelyn called out, her voice cutting through the soft hum of conversation. "Is everything all right over there?" Jason glanced up briefly, his brows furrowing in mild confusion. Liam chuckled nervously, brushing off the comment. "Everything's fine, ma'am," he assured her. But Evelyn wasn't convinced. She leaned toward her companion, whispering something inaudible but pointed, her gaze never leaving Jason. Jason collected his coffee and sat at a table by the window, taking a moment to exhale and relish the brief solitude. He was used to people staring, but tonight felt different. This wasn't the wide-eyed awe he usually encountered. This was something colder, more judgmental. From across the room, Evelyn's murmurs grew louder. "I swear, that guy looks just like the man in the police sketch. You know, the one who's been breaking into garages around here. The news said he's been targeting places like this, quiet and easy to slip away." Her companion, an older gentleman named Harold, squirmed uncomfortably. "Maybe you're mistaken, Evelyn. He's just having a coffee." "Harold, I have an eye for these things," she insisted, "and I'm not about to sit by and do nothing." Jason, oblivious to the brewing storm, sipped his coffee and stared out the window, lost in thought. The weariness of the day's shoot weighed heavily on him, but the warmth of the drink provided a small comfort. Evelyn, emboldened by her self-righteousness, stood up abruptly and marched toward the counter, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. "Excuse me, young man," she addressed Liam, her voice firm. "Do you know who that man is?" Liam blinked, caught off guard. Not personally, no. He just ordered some coffee." Evelyn leaned closer, lowering her voice, but still loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. "I think he's the one they're looking for. The thief." Liam's expression faltered, glancing uncertainly at Jason, who was now folding his arms and leaning back in his chair, blissfully unaware of the accusation being leveled against him. "You can't be serious," Liam replied, trying to keep his tone polite but incredulous. "He just came in for some food." "That's how they operate," Evelyn hissed. "Acting all casual, like they belong. I've seen it before. Call the police before he makes a run for it." The barista hesitated, caught between the pushy customer and his own better judgment. Across the room, other patrons began to take notice, casting curious glances toward Jason. Meanwhile, Jason, sensing the shift in energy around him, finally looked up. His sharp instincts, honed from years of intense roles and real-life challenges, told him something was off. He caught Liam's uneasy expression and Evelyn's piercing glare. "Is there a problem?" Jason asked, his voice calm but firm. Evelyn stepped forward, pointing a manicured finger. "The problem is people like you, skulking around and causing trouble. You think you can walk in here looking like that and nobody will notice?" Jason raised an eyebrow, fighting the urge to laugh. "Like what? Hungry? Don't play coy with me," she snapped. "I know what you're up to." The cafe fell silent, all eyes on the unfolding scene. Jason set down his coffee, his jaw tightening slightly. "Lady, I don't know what you think I've done, but I just came here for dinner." "That's what they all say," Evelyn shot back, her voice rising. "I'm calling the cops." Liam, clearly distressed, interjected. "Ma'am, I think this is a misunderstanding." "No, it's not," Evelyn interrupted. "I'm doing the right thing." Jason leaned back, crossing his arms. "Go ahead," he said coolly. "Call them. I've got time." Evelyn's hand hovered over her phone, emboldened by Jason's nonchalant attitude. She dialed, loudly declaring the suspicious individual at the cafe to the dispatcher. The room buzzed with whispers as tension thickened in the air. Jason sat calmly, his mind calculating his next move. He wasn't angry, yet, but the situation was escalating fast, and he knew he had to tread carefully. For now, he would wait. After all, the truth had a way of revealing itself, even in the most absurd circumstances. As Evelyn hung up the phone, the tension in the cafe became unbearable. Patrons whispered in hushed tones, their glances darting between Jason and Evelyn. Some appeared to side with her, clearly uneasy about his rugged appearance, while others seemed uncomfortable with her bold accusations. Jason remained seated, his calm demeanor betraying the flicker of irritation building beneath the surface. He wasn't new to misunderstandings or assumptions. His career often thrust him into situations where people judged based on appearances. But being outright accused of theft by a stranger in a public space was a new level of absurdity. Liam, the young barista, approached Jason cautiously, wringing his hands. "I'm really sorry about this," he said quietly, his voice tinged with embarrassment. She's kind of intense." Jason offered a faint smile, appreciating the attempt to mediate. "Don't worry, mate. This isn't my first run-in with a Karen," he quipped, leaning back in his chair. His casual response elicited a nervous chuckle from Liam, but the unease lingered in the air. Evelyn, emboldened by her call, crossed her arms triumphantly. "You might as well stay put," she declared loudly, her gaze fixed on Jason. "The police will sort this out." Jason tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You know," he said, his voice smooth yet edged with steel, "you've got a lot of nerve accusing someone you know nothing about." "I know enough," Evelyn snapped. "You walk in here looking like that, and it's obvious you don't belong." Jason let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "You're judging me based on a costume. You ever think there's more to people than what they're wearing?" Evelyn's cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. "You're deflecting. Typical behavior of someone who's guilty." Before Jason could respond, the distant sound of sirens cut through the tension. All eyes turned toward the large cafe windows, where flashing blue and red lights grew brighter by the second. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, and two officers stepped out, their expressions neutral as they approached the door. The cafe door chimed as the officers entered. The taller of the two, Officer Daniels, surveyed the room with practiced authority. "We received a call about a suspicious individual," he said, his gaze landing on Evelyn. "That's him," Evelyn declared, pointing an accusatory finger at Jason. "He's the one causing trouble." Daniels turned to Jason, who remained seated, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. "Sir, Would you mind stepping outside with us for a moment? The officer asked, his tone measured but firm. Jason nodded and stood, his presence commanding even in the face of such tension. Sure thing, officer. Let's clear this up. As Jason passed Evelyn, he paused briefly. You might want to rethink how quickly you judge people, he said quietly, before following the officers outside. The cafe buzzed with nervous energy as patrons speculated about what would happen next. Evelyn, smug in her perceived victory, returned to her seat, watching the scene unfold through the window with a self-satisfied expression. Outside, Jason stood with the officers under the glow of the street lamp. Daniels glanced at his partner, Officer Ramirez, before addressing Jason. Mind showing us some ID? Jason reached into his pocket, retrieving his wallet. He handed over his driver's license, and Daniels inspected it carefully. His brow furrowed as he read the name. Jason Statham? He repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. He exchanged a glance with Ramirez, who raised an eyebrow. Jason smirked. The one and only? Daniels stared at the ID again, then looked up at Jason, clearly trying to reconcile the scruffy man before him with the Hollywood star. You're telling me you're the Jason Statham? Jason shrugged. Not telling you. Proving it. Ramirez chuckled softly, finally recognizing him. Man, my wife's obsessed with your movies. She made me watch The Transporter like 10 times. Daniel shot his partner a look, but couldn't hide his own amusement. All right, Mr. Statham, can you explain what's going on? Jason gestured to his outfit. I just came from a film shoot. Didn't have time to clean up before grabbing dinner. Walked in here, ordered a coffee, and suddenly, I'm public enemy number 1. Daniel sighed, clearly irritated with the situation. So you're saying this is all a misunderstanding? Exactly, Jason said, his tone calm but firm. And honestly, it's been enlightening. Inside the cafe, Evelyn continued to watch, her confidence wavering as she saw the officers laugh with Jason. Moments later, they all walked back in, and the cafe fell silent once again. Daniels addressed the room. Ladies and gentlemen, there's been a misunderstanding. This gentleman, he gestured to Jason, is not a suspect in any crime. The announcement hung in the air, and all eyes turned to Evelyn, whose smug expression had dissolved into one of mortification. Jason approached the counter and leaned against it casually. Mind if I finish my coffee now? He asked Liam, his tone light but pointed. Of course, Liam stammered, quickly preparing a fresh cup. As Jason returned to his seat, Evelyn stood abruptly, her face red. I was just trying to do the right thing, she muttered defensively. Jason met her gaze, his eyes piercing but not unkind. Sometimes the right thing is to keep an open mind, he said evenly. You never know who someone really is, or what they've been through. Evelyn faltered, then turned and hurried out of the cafe, her companion trailing behind her. The door chimed shut, leaving a hushed silence in her wake. Jason took a sip of his coffee, savoring the quiet. Liam approached hesitantly. Again, I'm really sorry about all that, he said. Your meal's on the house. Jason smiled. No need for that, mate. But thanks. The cafe gradually returned to its usual rhythm, though the night's events lingered in the minds of everyone present. For Jason, it was a reminder of how quickly people judge based on appearances, a lesson he hoped a few of them might carry forward. As the cafe settled into an uneasy calm, Jason leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee with a subtle smirk on his face. He could feel the eyes of the patrons darting toward him, curiosity and guilt mingling in their gazes. Despite the uncomfortable atmosphere, Jason remained composed, his years of navigating the unpredictable nature of fame preparing him for moments like this. Liam, the young barista, cautiously approached Jason's table once more, holding a small plate with a slice of cheesecake. I know you said you didn't want anything on the house, Liam said sheepishly. But, consider this a peace offering. Not everyone here knows how to behave. Jason chuckled softly, his rugged features softening as he accepted the plate. "Thanks, mate," he said, taking a forkful. "You've got a good head on your shoulders. Don't lose it." Liam smiled, a bit more relaxed now, and returned to the counter. Jason could hear snippets of conversations around him, patrons whispering about the night's drama. "I can't believe she just assumed," one woman murmured. "Do you think he really is Jason Statham?" her companion replied, clearly still skeptical. "Who cares who he is?" another patron chimed in, quieter but firm. "The way she acted was just wrong." Jason smirked to himself but kept his focus on his dessert. The situation had been diffused, but the experience left him contemplative. It wasn't about being recognized or validated. It was about how quickly people were willing to judge and dismiss someone based solely on appearances. He thought back to his early days, struggling to make ends meet, working as a street vendor in London before his big break. Back then, he'd encountered the same dismissive attitudes, the same snap judgments. A shadow crossed his table, breaking his thoughts. He looked up to see an older woman, elegantly dressed, standing awkwardly with her hands clasped in front of her. Her demeanor suggested she was unused to apologizing, but felt compelled to do so. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "What happened tonight shouldn't have happened." Jason studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, then gave a slight nod. "Thank you," he replied simply. The woman hesitated, then returned to her table. Her gesture seemed to embolden others, and soon a few more patrons approached, offering quiet apologies or words of support. Jason acknowledged each one with a polite nod, though he couldn't help but notice how the tide of public opinion shifted now that his identity had been revealed. Sophia, one of the cafe servers, approached last. She had been quietly observing the night's events from the sidelines, her initial hesitance replaced with a newfound determination. "I just want to say," she began, her voice steady, "you handled that way better than most people would have, and I'm sorry you had to." Jason tilted his head, intrigued by her candor. "You don't need to apologize for something you didn't do," he said, "but thanks." Sophia hesitated, then smiled. "For what it's worth, I think you made some people think twice about how they treat others. That's not nothing." Jason nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe so," he said, his tone contemplative. "It's funny, though. People always seem to need a reminder that we're all just human." As the cafe began to empty, Jason finished his coffee and cheesecake, leaving a generous tip for Liam and Sophia before gathering his things. As he stepped outside, the cool night air greeted him, carrying the faint hum of the city. The events of the evening played in his mind, a reminder of the assumptions people make and the importance of humility. He glanced up at the stars, his thoughts shifting from frustration to gratitude. Life had taught him resilience, and tonight was no exception. With a deep breath, Jason walked toward his car, ready to leave the night's drama behind. But as he turned the key in the ignition, a small voice called out from behind him. "Mr. Statham?" He turned to see Sophia standing at the edge of the lot, her breath visible in the cold air. She looked both nervous and determined, clutching a small notebook. "I know this might sound crazy," she said, approaching cautiously, "but I've always dreamed of being in the film industry. I've been saving up to take classes, but I don't know. I guess I've been afraid it's too big of a dream." Jason studied her for a moment, recognizing the same hunger and uncertainty he had felt years ago. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to her. "This is my assistant's number," he said. "Call her tomorrow. I can't promise anything, but I can give you a chance to see what the industry's really like." Sophia's eyes widened in disbelief. "Really?" she breathed. Jason smiled. "Dreams are only too big if you let them be. You've got the courage to ask. That's a good start." As she clutched the card, tears welling in her eyes, Jason gave her a nod and got into his car. Driving away, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The night might have started with misunderstanding and judgment, but it ended with connection, and possibility. And for Jason Statham, that was worth more than any apology. As Jason drove away from the cafe, the city lights blurred past his windows. The night's events left a bittersweet taste, but Sophia's determination reminded him why he valued authenticity and kindness. People like her, who dared to dream despite the odds, were a rare find. He pulled into his driveway, the familiar surroundings of home grounding him after a whirlwind of emotions. His phone buzzed as he stepped inside. A message from his assistant, Ellen. Ellen, heard about the cafe incident. Everything okay? Jason chuckled softly. News traveled fast, even within his inner circle. He replied quickly. Jason, yeah, all good. Just another reminder of how the world works. We'll fill you in tomorrow. He dropped his keys on the counter and made himself a cup of tea, his mind still replaying the judgmental glances and whispers from the cafe. Despite their initial harshness, he couldn't shake the feeling that something positive had come from it. Sophia's courage, the patrons' slow realization of their own biases, and even the small apologies from those who approached him. The next morning, Jason's routine began as usual, except for one thing. He couldn't stop thinking about Sophia. Her boldness to share her aspirations in a moment when most people would shy away stayed with him. He decided to check in with Ellen.